Good morning, and thank you for joining us for the third session of our Health Equity Capacity Building series. My name is Margaret Shield. I'm the coalition organizer for Washington Breeze, and I use she, her pronouns. We appreciate each of you being here, and we hope that you will use the Zoom chat to just introduce yourself to the group with your name, your pronouns, your organization, and anything else you'd like to share today. Thank you. As we start our meeting, I'd like to acknowledge and offer this land acknowledgement. We honor that in Washington State, we gather on the lands of the Northwest Coast Salish and Plateau tribes. We recognize their invaluable contributions to our state's history, economy, and culture. This acknowledgement is a reminder to support tribal sovereignty, self-determination, and upholding our government-to-government relationships. And these commitments are part of our efforts to form a more just and equitable society. So for the next year, we're partnering with the Center for Black Health and Equity on this series to learn together to grow and diversify participation in our coalition and to create our action plan to work together towards ending the sale of menthol and flavored commercial tobacco products. Our coalition is statewide, and we're working to reduce the harmful impacts of commercial tobacco use, sales, and tactics on our communities. We work on policy systems and environmental changes to reduce disparities and improve health. And you can find more information about our vision and mission on Washington Breeze, which is online at washingtonbreeze.org. And as we work on policy systems and environmental change, as we work to carry out our mission and advance toward our vision, we use three overarching strategies. We build our capacity and skills, we increase understanding and awareness about commercial tobacco issues, and we join together to amplify our voices for policy and systems change. Today, we'll be learning and planning together about developing a strategic education campaign on the importance of ending the sale of menthol and flavored commercial tobacco products. So I'm sharing this slide to explain that as a coalition, Washington Breeze works on policy change education, but we do not lobby or organize lobbying activities in our meetings because some of our current funding is from federal and state sources that prohibit lobbying. Some of our members can and do lobby, and we understand that. Others of our members cannot lobby, and we understand that. The spaces you can work in depend on the type of organization you're in and where that organization draws the line for you. What I'm calling policy change education covers education and careful advocacy that does not cross into lobbying. Educating about issues and problems is something everyone can do. When we advocate, we link that education to a policy solution, like how ending the sale of flavored products would protect communities and save lives. We do advocacy cautiously to avoid crossing over into lobbying, and lobbying is where there's a specific request for action on a piece of legislation. By working together in the policy change arena, our coalition can do a lot to raise awareness about problems and solutions. Our coalition communications, materials, website, and your outreach can support policy changes that our communities need. And with that introduction, let's get into today's session. I'll turn it over to Rod Liu, and we're very pleased that Rod can join us. He's the founder and executive director of AAPI.
Thanks very much, Margaret, and good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, wherever you may be. I'm actually sitting in for Tana Lapula, who was supposed to do this presentation, but unfortunately had a family matter to kind of attend to. I am currently at the Department of Health and Human Services building for a White House summit on mental health in Washington, D.C. And unfortunately, the room they gave me is not well lit, so I apologize for that. But I wanted to share a little bit about the work that we do in hopes that it can contribute to the conversations that you're having in your strategic planning. Let me just pull up this presentation. I got to go back to the beginning here. Can everybody see that okay? Okay.
Yes.
The organization that I'm a part of, AAPI, Asian Pacific Partners for Empowerment, Advocacy, and Leadership, has actually been around for nearly 30 years. We will have our 30th anniversary next year. So we have been involved in a lot of the tobacco control work, particularly in California, but also nationally for a long time. I want to kind of take a different attempt to look at how we talk about tobacco control policy by talking about the communities that we work with. We work with a very diverse Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities. And each community has a history, has a story to be told. And it's really important to really start from that place before jumping in and talking about policy solutions. I'm going to be sharing a number of community engagement principles, the first one being understanding community context, which is very connected to the community model that I'm sure that Ashley is going to be talking about later. For myself, I'm a third generation Chinese American. My family has been here since the 1900s, but there's a history kind of behind our community in the fact that with immigration in the mid 1880s, it resulted in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, one of the few groups that has been excluded from entering in this country. And that has really affected a lot of the immigration patterns and really how our community is addressed on a federal level, but really how that seeps down into everyday work. Interestingly, my father, that's a picture of my father,
Rod,
served.
I just want to let you know, we see all of your slides instead of just the one that you're on. I hated to interrupt.
I wonder why that is.
If you double click maybe on the one that you're in to start the presentation.
Okay, maybe I should stop the share and start again.
If that works for you, yes. I'm sorry. I just didn't want anyone to miss the
Okay.
beautiful presentation you put together.
Maybe I've got double presentations up here. Okay. All right, let me just start again. Apologize for that. Can you see an individual slide yet?
There we go. Perfect. Thank you so
Okay.
much.
All right. Okay, this is a different presentation. Okay, let me just go with this and then we'll see what happens. Okay. So as I was telling you the story of my family, my father served in the US Navy during World War II. And over time, there was a recognition, and this just happened a couple of years ago, where Congress recognized the contributions of Chinese Americans in the military during World War II, particularly because of that longer history of excluding Chinese into this country and the racism that our communities had faced. And this is a personal story, but it's an example of the many stories that the diverse Asian American community has faced. Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders is a separate racial group, and there's equal numbers of richness in the stories that kind of set the scene for us to be able to do our work. One of the pieces I really wanted to mention, though, is that while there has been policy that has been steeped in racism, there's also been portrayal of different communities. And this is a caption of to try to capture the span of decades and centuries of racism media, from the Yellow Peril to more recently around COVID, where the former president referred to COVID as Kung Flu. And that actually has resulted in a complete rise in anti-Asian hate in this country. And that is something that is really important for even addressing tobacco issues. Tobacco is a social justice issue, but the second principle is that we have our own story of tobacco, from the recognition of the sacred use to the growing of tobacco, and kind of the richness of how our communities have had a different experience from the general population around commercial tobaccalization and commercialization. For the Pacific Islander community, this has been something that I mentioned has been occurring for generations. And there's actually a book, for those of you who are interested, called Drinking Smoke, that actually chronicles tobacco use in Oceania by focusing on how commercial tobacco coincides with the 4 waves of colonization in the Pacific region. And so this is a story that we don't often hear about, not just in terms of racism in our communities, but really how commercial tobacco kind of fits in. This endemic is an example of where there are multiple things that are happening at the same time, multiple pandemics. Usually during the time of COVID, we kind of describe that as not only a COVID pandemic, but it's endemic that kind of merges COVID, racism, mental health, and tobacco, if you will. For our community, we have been exposed to marketing just like other communities. We captured the history of the tobacco industry documents, which talked about how they recognized the growth of the Asian American population and recognized that that was a potential for consumer influence. So they began to develop relationships, for example, with Asian retailers. But even after the master settlement agreement, the campaigns targeting our communities didn't stop. To this day, there are promotions and advertisements that continue to target our communities in different ways, particularly with flavors and with menthol. The story of commercial tobacco control really focuses on policy change, and you've all seen this. I'll only say that, we like to talk about this story of commercial tobacco and how it has resulted in the decrease in cigarette consumption. But as we talk about trying to achieve the end game, the real questions come as we reflect on how we've done, has smoking prevalence declined for all communities at the same rate? And usually the answer is no. So as we talk about health equity for our communities, we're not just talking about commercial tobacco control, we're talking about other things like social determinants of health, and the fact that there are many factors that result in why our communities have high smoking rates in the first place, why there's a lack of resources for our communities, and the importance of addressing commercial tobacco control holistically. In other words, perhaps just focusing on tobacco control policy changes is not enough. I'm here at a White House Summit on mental health, and clearly there's a strong connection between mental health and smoking in our community. But there has to be a way to culturally tailor those approaches so that it has significance for each of our racial communities and ethnic groups. I'm going to skip this because I did have a different presentation in mind, but let's keep continuing. So I think it's really important, because everybody is using the terms health equity, for us to really examine, what does that mean? What does that look like? And health equity as a systems change approach is really the focus of where we want to see things. We want to be able to not only make sure that there's funding for different communities to do this commercial tobacco control work, but that we recognize that institutions are responsible for the way that inequities have appeared and manifest in each of our communities. And that relates to institutional racism, institutional homophobia, institutional transphobia, and that our communities, the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities, are no different in terms of how that impacts us in a negative way. So there are many definitions of health equity. I'm not going to stay too long on this. Most of them include a piece around fairness. But as we begin to talk about health equity, we want to make sure that there's a particular focus on systems change, building community power, and addressing, as I said, the institutional pieces that are very much prevalent in our communities. Health equity is not just about things like cultural competency. Certainly there is a cultural competency angle to how we do our work and how you might want to incorporate into your strategic plan, but it's very different. It's really about systems change. It isn't about learning about everything you can about every single ethnicity. There's also the recognition that building community power means also building community ownership, so that if you're working with a marginalized community, they have to be involved in every step of the way, and not just when, you know, a bill needs to be passed, but really also in terms of, you know, developing that, doing the strategic planning, that there are community members that are engaged in that approach. And those are community engagement principles, but I'm sure that you all are very well aware of. The fourth equity principle that I wanted to focus on is disaggregating data. For our community, because we are such a diverse community, the information about our community is often lumped together. And there's the assumption that because it's all lumped together and that it may appear that overall there are low smoking rates, that actually when you break it down, for example, separating Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders from Asian Americans, or even breaking Asian Americans into different subgroups and by gender, you can see that there are particular segments of our population that have extremely high rates. One piece that adds to this whole idea of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders as a healthy minority is this concept of a model minority myth. And these covers from long ago, Newsweek in Time, that they still actually appear sometimes, was captured in this article written by Drs. Moon Chen and Betty Lee Hawks around how to debunk this myth of a healthy Asian American and Pacific Islander community. The idea that data disaggregation can reveal segments of the population that are at very high risk, but that this actually translates into policy, so that this assumption then translates into how agencies tend to react to our communities and tend to gloss over the fact that there are really needs within our communities around tobacco. This gives you some of the ideas of how Asians are lumped together into one, just by separating out Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders, which is the NHPI. You can see that there are very high rates of use. Let me just back up here and also say that the National Youth Tobacco Survey actually showed, when you group together 3 years of data for Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, that Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander youth had the highest vaping rates and the second highest use of cigarettes among all racial groups. And that just gives you one example of the idea that this doesn't necessarily appear in the data that we see on a regular basis, whether on a national level, a state level, or even locally. Equity principle 4 is really starting where communities are. We have always used our community readiness model as a way to start, recognizing that even within our diverse community, that we can't just create one blanket approach and expect that every community is going to be able to gravitate and understand and be able to kind of address those issues all at the same starting place, and recognizing that readiness is really important to measure. It's also important to measure in terms of how to provide tailored technical assistance and training, and being able to give credit to communities for actually moving along a continuum of readiness rather than being able to accomplish these larger outcomes that are often expected by funders. Equity principle 5 is investing in building community capacity and policy and power, rather. The community leadership program has always been a way that we have used to engage our diverse Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, and Asian American communities. This is an example of some of the trainings that we've done for the past 2.5 decades. Different type of training that kind of builds trust within the group and provides an opportunity for people to share their stories where they would not necessarily feel comfortable or safe to be able to do that if they're not in a trusting environment. We were shortly after starting our leadership program for our community, we were asked by other communities to collaborate and eventually began to develop cross-cultural leadership trainings. And one of the first states that we were invited to help to facilitate a cross-cultural leadership training was in Washington State. And that was maybe a couple of decades ago. And since that time, there have been several leadership opportunities that we have been working with Washington communities in developing around commercial tobacco control. But the example that I want to provide a little bit more attention to is the LAMP Leadership Institute from the state of Minnesota, initially funded by Clearway, Minnesota, where our organization was contracted to lead leadership training, a year-long leadership training for 30 fellows from 5 different priority populations, the 4 racial groups and LGBTQ. And over a span of 10 years, we were able to train 100 fellows from each of those communities to engage in policy change around commercial tobacco control. And one of the examples I want to give is the picture on the bottom, where the fellows from the African-American cohort decided that they wanted to make foster care smoke-free in Ramsey County. And so they started meeting with commissioners to try to get them to buy into it. And after a very short amount of time, probably a couple of months, they were able to get Ramsey County commissioners to sign on to smoke-free foster care. But what happens next is really the magic of really building community power. When the other adjoining counties saw that this was being passed, they were very interested in doing something similar into their own counties, and soon statewide smoke-free foster care was being considered and really thought of as an important thing to implement. Certainly foster care is not just for African American families in Minnesota, it's for all communities. And this example of one of the ways that our fellows have been engaged really shows the power of community in being able to not only address issues for their own community, but really issues across all communities. And we shouldn't be thinking that it's a model that is a deficit model, but it's really kind of an asset model of being able to tap into the rich contributions of our diverse communities across the board. I'm going to skip this for sake of time to go to the next principle, which is really the idea of moving towards equity-based policies. I've been doing tobacco control for probably 30 years and have seen a lot of different shifts. One of the first shifts around tobacco control was in California, where they did recognize that policy change was the way to go. It was really at the time where it was still seen as a kind of an individual intervention, and that paradigm shift to policy change through the tobacco tax was really kind of a key step back in the early 1990s. Well, I'm seeing as we reflect over the past couple of decades, we need a new paradigm shift, new paradigm shift that really focuses on health equity as a policy itself, and to recognize that we need to look at how we do commercial tobacco control policy in a different way. This poster that you see there was created by a local artist in Minnesota in collaboration with the LAMP Fellows, where you can see most significantly the contributions of communities, the different meaning of tobacco, the sacred use of tobacco, the role of our communities, not only in the growing of tobacco, but also in the tobacco control movement. But hopefully you'll see also most significantly our communities coming together and the power that that provides and the wave that it creates in terms of moving towards change. We at Appeal have tried to look at policy change a little bit differently. So while there's a lot of attention around the legislative level, we recognize because of the readiness differences that we have to focus and provide different entrees into policy change. So sometimes it may be through community policy. Sometimes it may be through recognizing that health equity needs to be changed within health systems, such as health departments. So these are all combined together to make our four-pronged policy change model. I'm going to skip this. I'm sorry, I'm skipping ahead because this is a different presentation to go to the end right here. Those of you in public health recognize the logic model. It's something that we use a lot in our work. You can see how our readiness and our leadership development and our four-pronged policy change model hopes to lead towards reduced tobacco use and health equity. But when we talk about this with our communities, this does not have an impact for communities. They don't understand this. And that's why we created this version, which is what we call our journey, our river journey, which really describes how we envision our communities leading to become involved in the policy change work that we do. And I'll just point you to the bridge, which is really the piece that separates sometimes where our communities are at and where we want them to go. When we are engaged, sometimes when mainstreams are engaged, for example, in tobacco control policy, a lot of times we're already on the right side of the bridge or on the east side of the bridge. We're already actively engaged in that. But when you talk about Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders, and other marginalized communities, the reality is that many of our communities are on the left side of the bridge or on the west side of the bridge, still in the assessment phase and even the capacity building phase. And so this really just gives a picture of one, being able to describe the journey that we all want to get to together, but the reality of where our communities are. And if you're creating a strategic plan, is everybody in the same place on that journey? And this gives you an idea of how we've been trying to work with our marginalized communities to be able to get them to the place where they can get to the bridge and then over the bridge into more active policy change. So I'm going to just stop there by asking a couple of questions that we often ask ourselves. Are we using an equity framework? What that actually means? I have a colleague, Dr. Moon Chen, who's known for saying it's not about trying to get to hard to reach people or communities. It's about hardly reached communities. And what that really says to me is that whose responsibility is it for everybody to be involved? Is it really our own marginalized communities' responsibility to try to get everybody there? Or is it all of our communities, for example, in commercial tobacco control, to reach those that are hardly reached? So that's a critical question for how you approach the work that we do. And then we're always asking ourselves, how can we do this better to reach the right people? And that includes for us too, is we're always kind of thinking and reflecting about, the past several years. Have we been successful and how can we do it better? We have such a diverse group that we may be reaching, one ethnic subgroup, for example, Chinese Americans very well, but there might be another group like Hmong who we're barely reaching. And so we constantly have to kind of ask ourselves those questions as we ask others to ask themselves those questions. Finally, I'll just say a piece around equity collaboratives, because I think this is really, really important. In California, we created the ADEPT Equity Collaborative, which are representatives from 5 racial groups in LGBTQ. Many of us have been working with each other for decades. It includes Carol Magruder, Dr. Phil Gardner, Gloria Solis, Dr. Lourdes Baez-Conde Garbinati, Lou Morner, and others. And we have worked to try to help address changing systems from an equity approach. And we are not funded as a separate entity, but recognizing that we provide free guidance to, for example, the state of California's tobacco control program and how they work forward. I think that in Washington State, there's something similar. There are advocates such as AAPI and Center for Multicultural Health and other diverse groups that have been working in Washington for decades, who really have the pulse on how to, not only what needs to be done, but how to approach the work that we want to see happen in communities. So I'm going to stop there just to see if there's any questions or any comments that people have before I sign off. But thank you so much for the opportunity of being able to share some of the things that we're trying to do.